Hello everybody, this is ManuS, and welcome back to another Legends of Runeterra deck tech. It's time to talk about what I think is arguably the best deck right now. It's at the very least tied for best deck with one or two other options basically. But yeah, I think it is better than anything else that I can think of, including the other top decks, and that is Fizz Twisted Fate. Yes, I think it is better than Ophelia's Twisted Fate, for example, and I might talk about that a bit later. But yeah, I have been playing this deck for a while, even before we got the new cards, before we got stress testing, and have had really good results with it. And yeah, the deck is super fun, it's super versatile, it's really hard to reliably beat with anything, really. So even the unfavorable matchups are not hugely unfavorable and are still fairly winnable and stuff like that, which is why I also expect the deck to be probably the most banned deck going forward in the seasonal, because you just can't really reliably target it. Like, finding one deck that beats it reliably enough is already hard, but finding three is basically impossible, I think. So you're usually just safer just banning it. Since you give your opponent like more win percentage in the match by letting them have it, I think, in most cases, compared to like banning something else. There are cases where that might not be true, but I think on average, like Fizz Twisted Fate brings the highest sort of win percentage gain to a match of Tournament Runeterra that any deck is capable of, basically. Anyways, before we dive into the deck, you know the drill. Hit the subscribe button down below, turn on notification icon to not miss out on future content. And now let's talk about the deck. Alright, so I think the core of the deck is basically 33 cards that I will break down here, and then we'll dive into the other 7 slots, the options, and my thoughts on them, basically. But I think these 33 cards are basically what, in my opinion, should be in every list. I have seen some lists that issue some of these cards or some numbers on those, but I think they're making a huge mistake. But I'll be getting into that too. So first off, we have the units that are in all the lists. Basically, have our champions. We have Fizz and Twisted Fate. Not much to say here. This is, to an extent, still the same as it used to be with the old Twisted Fate Fizz deck that the German player built, and I made a video about and really enjoyed. Basically against some decks that have like a lot of spot removal, reactive decks, especially like the ones without Hush, you're primarily sort of a Fizz deck, because Fizz is really hard for them to answer, and it's a really reliable threat to pressure them from early on. And against like more removal light and board presence heavy decks, especially if they have challengers and stuff, you are more of a Twisted Fate deck. Although against challenger decks, it can be trickier to get Twisted Fate to stick and level, but it's still much more doable than against a lot of removal. So you're either like a Fizz deck or a Twisted Fate deck, depending on your matchup, and identifying that certainly helps with your mulligans and what to prioritize to an extent. And yeah, the more board you face, the more important becomes Twisted Fate as sort of like a board control tool. Then we have the other units. I'll include Poro Cannon here, so basically Poro Cannon, Ballistic Bot, Spray Fin, and Burblefish. As you can see, all but Ballistic Bot are elusive, and even Ballistic Bot deals one sort of unblockable damage return, which is kind of where it's at. The deck is mostly deceptively sort of an elusive deck in disguise, just pretty different to what we are used to from elusive decks in the past, because they were more like curving up to like 7, curving out sort of mid-range beatdown decks, and this is more of like a lower curve sort of tempo aggro deck, more comparable to like modern Delver decks in Magic. Since there's very little interaction, we don't really have much counter magic in Runeterra anyway, other than in Ionia to an extent, so that sort of light counter element from Delver disappears. But otherwise you basically have like a lot of like velocity, card draw, card cycling, some removal that can also double as burn, and a bunch of cheap, hard to block, efficient threats, basically. And yeah, so not much to say about the units really. Bot is just very good. It provides a decent board presence early to block some early units. The ignition is nice for rummage. It's nice for like Fizz being able to attack. It's discard fodder for Poro Cannon. It can be used to use pick a card. It also helps make Burblefish cheaper. It just does a bunch of good things. And yeah, Sprayfin, just a staple in Twisted Fate decks, really. It's just a good unit, nice value, draws good cards in this deck mostly, so it has a huge impact, not just by being a 2-for-1, but also getting you like fairly impactful cards usually, and providing some pressure. And Burblefish is like the new superstar that we got a while ago and took a little till he found his home. But what can you say, a 0-cost 3/1 that draws you a 1-cost spell is pretty powerful. One would argue it is broken. And it becomes even more so with iterative improvement, which virtually provides more units, both by copying opposing units as well as our own. Primarily Burblefish, sometimes also Sprayfin or Bot, and sometimes you're desperate enough and it's worthwhile to even copy a Poro, make a 3-cost 2/2 elusive, which on rate is by no means terrible if you look at the cost of elusive units. So those are kind of the units. Then we have the remaining spells. Also, one thing to note about like Poro Cannon, it's also pretty great at protecting Fizz, making it really hard for the opponent to try and go for killing Fizz, because you might always have a Poro Cannon that kind of screws them over for free, generating further like large amounts of tempo. Like that's where part of the tempo component comes from. Then we have card draw, rummage, and pick a card. They also happen to play really well with each other, because if you have a rummage, it's much easier to aggressively pick a card, because if you draw too many cards with fleeting that you can't play, you can just rummage them away and turn them into real cards. Then there's obviously the synergy with Ballistic Bot that I mentioned. And obviously being able to draw 2 cards for 1 mana in a Twisted Fate deck makes it so much easier and faster to level Twisted Fate that it's amazing. And that leaves us with Get Excited. Get Excited, I think, at this point in the game is really, really good. In the beginning, there was a lot fewer like good and reliable and early options to fuel the discard cost, making the card quite costly. But now we have such a huge array of sort of free card generating cards in a lot of regions that you can pair with the already good options in PNZ, like Ballistic Bot and stuff like that, that Get Excited is pretty close to just being 3 mana, deal 3 damage to anything at fast speed, which is by any standard in a game in this game an amazing rate. It's like it's not quite as good as Lightning Bolt and Magic, but I think to an extent it's kind of close, because spells are just so much more expensive, and dealing 3 to anything for 3 is just a prime rate. And I think that's what makes the card so good. Plus the fact that a lot of things you need and want to kill in the game right now have 3 health, or in the case of Twisted Fate, can be brought to like 3 health with something like Pale Cascade in some matchups. So Get Excited is also a pretty versatile removal, and obviously 3 damage to the face in the deck with a bunch of elusives and direct damage from Ballistic Bot and Red Card adds up quickly, and a double Get Excited draw can quickly end in your opponent dying prematurely. And then last but not least, we have Suit Up, another really powerful card that I think makes this deck work. And I have seen people running less than 3, and it's just blows my mind. Like, the card is just insane. Like, even if you have to play it for 4, it's still really good. If you play it for 4 in this deck, it's more or less a standalone, except it works with more than 1 unit in play, so it's a more flexible standalone. Sure, sometimes it will be weaker if you use it on a Sprayfin, for example. It's only +2/+2, but it still doesn't require you to only have a single unit. And every time you get to draw it and play it for 2 mana, the card is just straight up broken. Like, one of the best openers obviously is Poro Cannon or Fizz, or if you run another one drop into turn 2, suit up and attack, but it's obviously particularly good on the elusive units, because that provides such a like demanding board presence that is really awkward for a lot of opponents, both on offense and defense in those scenarios. Like imagine against an aggro deck where you drop like a 1-drop and then turn 2 you make a 4/4. Like suddenly they have no good attack because none of the units trade, and if they attack, you just eat one of the units for free and stuff like that. It's just very brutal. So yeah, this card is amazing. It also happens to be pretty good at protecting Twisted Fate. It's the main way you can protect your Twisted Fate, because this deck, unlike, for example, Aphelios Twisted Fate, is not very good at protecting its Twisted Fate. But that's why you have Fizz and why Fizz is important, because in matchups where you can't protect Twisted Fate very well, Fizz is usually an all-star and can make the game for you, while your Twisted Fate just draws blue cards and dies on sight. But that's the thing, even if Twisted Fate dies on sight, he's still a good card, because he's still it's basically 3 mana, 2 for 1. If you blue card. Plus, you always have the value to like red or yellow card to kill something and be like a 2 for 1 that also generates tempo that way. So yeah, there's no way to make Twisted Fate bad. Like in every conceivable scenario or context or interaction, Twisted Fate is gonna be like a net positive for you. So yeah, those are the 33 cards. Now let's talk about the other options. The most common and reasonable options, I think, let's take a look. I'm not gonna go too much into like more fringe options like Death Ray and stuff. I don't think that card is worthwhile. I know some people like it, but I think it's just too marginal, and the first part is fairly weak as an investment of a card. And since the MK2 and MK3 both take a while to draw and are not free cards, they just replace basically your draw step, means that, yeah, you need to reliably get good value out of the first. And I guess there's stuff like Zoe and Timo and so on, where this does some decent work. But yeah, all in all, I wouldn't recommend it. It's also way too reactive for a deck of this nature. This deck is still ultimately like a proactive sort of tempo, like aggressive tempo deck. And this makes more sense in sort of a reactive deck, also because it doesn't go face. Then we have Jagged Butcher, that the initial versions of the deck basically ran 2 to 3 Butchers. They have kind of faded away, but I gotta say, I've been a pretty big fan of Butchers. I played like a majority of my games recently with 3 Butchers. And yeah, they play pretty well. Like a 1-cost 3/3 is a really good rate. In the game, it's kind of like what I said about get excited, like a 1-cost 3/3 is pretty unfair in terms of rate. And the deck's fairly good at setting it up. Like you have your turn 1 elusive into like turn 2 open attack followed by a Butcher. You have turn 2 bot, turn 3 ignition, play Butcher, iterative improvement on a Butcher in the same scenario. Can also be really, really good because like a 1-cost, or rather in that case, a 3-cost 4/4 is also a really good rate. Remember Badger Bear before it got nerfed. It was considered too good as a 3-cost 4/4. This is the same, except that iterative improvement and Butcher both are much more flexible and powerful cards in their own right, while still being able to combine to a better 3-drop than what we were supposed to have in the game, basically, in the right conditions. And that has been surprisingly relevant to me. And in the early game, it doesn't really matter too much if your units are elusive or not, since a 3/3 or a 4/4 is pretty rough for a lot of board states and opponents right now, be it ballistic bots, be it the common like 1-drops that we see right now and stuff, because a lot of these things are kind of utilitarian, are like 2 attack units and stuff, or they are champions like Aphelios, which are 3/3 and really don't want to trade with your Jagged Butcher, and also can't trade with like a 4/4 Butcher. So it allows you to sort of apply a lot of pressure and gain a lot of like early momentum to a point where the opponent's much lower later on, and then kind of succumbs to your burn and tempo and elusives much, much easier. And it might seem kind of innocuous, but the impact that switching to 3 butchers had for me was much, much bigger than it seems or I would have expected, because in the beginning I actually played without butcher and then decided, okay, this is feeling a bit too clunky and a bit too dirtly, and I gotta try something else, and then I moved in on that, and that suddenly felt really good, because yeah, doing a lot of things in one turn and providing a lot of impact for little mana is precisely what a deck like this wants, because that's what a tempo deck is about, maximizing impact per mana spent, basically. And Butcher is amazing impact per mana spent ratio. Some of the Asians play some Jiriks. I think that's like very cute and gimmicky, and I would not recommend it. Parlay is also not really worth talking about. I think to an extent it's almost better than Death Ray, but it's still awkward. Then we have another like major one, Pool Shark. The initial deck had like 2 Pool Sharks, and there was a long time where I ran 3 Pool Sharks, and I've been pretty happy with them. And I think there is a decent argument to be made for Pool Shark being as good or better than stress testing, which I will be talking about as well. Because the thing is, in stress testing, kind of dilutes your spray fin a bit, because plenty of cases drawing a stress testing with your spray fin is really awkward, because if you don't have a way to discard it, it's just a dead card. Also, when you discard it, it's basically a 0 cost draw a card fleeting. This is a 1 cost 1/2 draw a card fleeting. So in a lot of scenarios, you would happily pay 1 extra mana on your stress testing if it would create a 1/2 in play. Sure, the downside with Pool Shark is that it draws the card a turn delayed as opposed to stress testing, which is the cost sort of getting the free 1 mana 1/2. But I think the 1 mana 1/2 is deceptively pretty impactful in that deck. First of all, Pool Shark into Suit Up. It's a super legit line in the early game that can provide a lot of offense or defense. Then turn 1 Pool Shark with Rummage or Poro Cannon works just fine if you just want to like trade with that 1 drop or get a chip damage in. Because especially if you don't have a turn 2 play, you can just Pool Shark. If you draw something you can play turn 2, you play it. If not, you have your Rummage or Poro Cannon backup. You just usually want to avoid playing it turn 1 without a Rummage or Poro Cannon, or if you already have a good turn 2 play like a Ballistic Bot. Like if you have a Ballistic Bot, you just don't play your Pool Shark and instead play turn 2 Ballistic Bot, and turn 3 probably Ignition and like Pool Shark. Also, obviously, the potential to have jump blockers to buy you time, or like soften units, like jump blocking a 2 health unit, so your Twisted Fate can clean it up with red card matters. So the 1/2 does all kinds of things, and it still helps Twisted Fate level, and so on and so forth. So yeah, still a pretty big fan of Pool Shark, and I think running, I don't know, 3 stress testing and 0 Pool Shark is almost certainly a mistake, but we'll get to that. Now, stress testing, I think I said like most about the card already. It's still pretty nice, but it's not as nice as it seems, I think, because, for example, if you want to Poro Cannon turn 1 or turn 2, discarding stress testing is really awkward, because instead of like with Pool Shark, you draw the card first and then have your discard as backup to sort of gain value out of it and still have traded even, because you got a like 1/2 and a free discard fodder for your discard spell. Now you're basically using it first, and then there's a fair share of things like in the early turns in the deck that you can't even use that you can draw with stress testing, and also some things you can draw and can use but might not want to, because you kind of want to develop your board and be proactive. So you're kind of like stuck in awkward situations where either stress testing forces you to play something that is suboptimal or waste a card. And once again, card is a bad top deck. The card is bad on its own. It heavily depends on your Rummages, Poro Cannons, and Get Exciteds to do stuff. And that might sound like a lot, but you don't want to like aggressively get excited just to draw a card with stress testing a lot of the time. You often don't want to Rummage too aggressively until you have your Twisted Fate. And you want to Poro Cannon aggressively a lot, where stress testing is a pretty poor discard. And yeah, there will be plenty of situations where stress testing just kind of sits around your hand and doesn't do anything, in my experience. So I would recommend against running 3. I think the card has merit because obviously, like going, I don't know, turn 4 with 3 spell mana, Twisted Fate, pick a card next turn, rummage stress testing to level the champion, to level Twisted Fate because you chose blue card, is the nice sort of Exodia dream scenario. But I think that is a bit of an overstated scenario, because if your Twisted Fate is going to die, he's going to die still, and is probably going to die before that happens. And if he isn't, you can either level him with a Spray Fin for the last card, or he levels naturally the next turn. You're usually at that stage in the game not in a situation where you highly depend on your Twisted Fate leveling the next turn, super importantly. But having the option is nice, to be fair. To some extent, you can get the option from Bubblefish. So yeah, 1 or 2 stress testing, it's fine. 3 stress testing, I'm not a fan of. I played with 3 stress testing, and they were kind of awkward. And then people play Urchin alongside their 3 stress testing, 2 or 3 sometimes. I tried that too. Not a big fan. Urchin gets worse the later you play it. Turn 1 Urchin stress testing is a non-starter most of the time because it doesn't synergize unless you, I guess, have a Poro Cannon to discard the card you drew from stress testing to that on turn 1 as well. And yeah, so you put a 1-drop in your deck that you can't really play well turn 1. You don't really want to cycle away any of your other cards usually because they're all great. The deck has just such a high card quality that cycling cards, especially in the early game, is not desirable. And 2-1 is kind of marginal anyway. So yeah, I would recommend Urchin even less to make your awkward stress testings less awkward. Just play less stress testing instead. Play 1 or 2 instead of 3, and then you don't need to bother with this like awkward dirtly Urchin. I thought there might be some merit, and I tried it, and it just doesn't feel good. Next we have Mystic Shot, another card that I have kind of mixed feelings about. Problem is Mystic Shot doesn't really kill most of the relevant things. Like even Twisted Fate, it's not great at killing, especially against Aphelia's Twisted Fate, because they have Vigor and Temple Buff and Pale Cascade. And in the mirror it's a bit better, but even there it's queued up. So it's not that great. It can't kill Aphelia's and stuff like that. It's not super great at dealing with Teemo or Zoe, especially because you have Poro Cannon to deal with those pretty well anyway by just blanking them, since elusive is not a reliable keyword against this deck. But there's something to be said about being able to kill opposing elusive blockers, be it Spray Fins, opposing fishes, Poros, Teemos, Zoes that are trying to block your elusives. And the fact that it deals damage to the Nexus has also merit, especially in conjunction with Get Excited and Red Card already doing that. So it's a reasonable option. I don't hate it, but so far I haven't really missed not having it. But we might, for the sake of giving it a fair shake, try a version with Mystic Shot for the games later in Ranked. The other alternative that I considered while talking to Josh Utter-Layton about the deck a bit and that he likes is basically Gotcha. Instead of 3 Mystic Shot, he runs 2 Gotcha and another card in the 3rd slot. Because Gotcha is a much better removal than Mystic Shot, because the like sort of bar to pass for like good removal right now I think is 3 damage, and 2 mana deals 3 damage is very good on the removal front, be it Ballistic Bot, Aphelia's Twisted Fate with some sort of backup, that sort of stuff. Even Fiora and all that stuff, Peddler. The downside is, if you can't play it for 2, it's kind of awkwardly clunky and a bit overcosted, and obviously it doesn't go to the Nexus, which is also why if you opt for Gotcha, 2 makes more sense than 3, because drawing too many means you will have to play them too often for 4 mana, and you will have them too often without targets that you actually need to kill, and also not being able to use them on the Nexus. But I think it's a pretty reasonable consideration. Mystic Shot specifically, especially on ladder, becomes better than it can be, because on ladder there are no bans, so there's a lot more mirrors, and in the mirror there's no Pale Cascade and Temple to buff Twisted Fate. There's only Suit Up, and that will a lot of the time already be used before, and ideally wants to be used on elusives like Poros and Fizz and not on TF to protect it. So Mystic Shot has a much higher chance of killing Twisted Fate, and killing Twisted Fate obviously is very, very important in a mirror. But in tournaments where you're probably gonna ban Fizz Twisted Fate anyway, I think Mystic Shot goes further down in value. And then we have one last card. That's Mind Meld. A lot of people run 1. A few people run 2. I'm really, really against 2. I am on the fence whether I like 1 or 0. In my experience, I've played the deck like 56 games right now. I'm 43-13 over the entirety of the games. Played most of the games with 1 Mind Meld. I think I can't remember a single game in all of those games where I actively needed Mind Meld or won because of Mind Meld or lost because I didn't have Mind Meld. To me, it seemed the way the deck usually plays out is in a way that you win decisively enough that you don't need Mind Meld, or lose decisively enough where Mind Meld usually doesn't save you either. There are certainly like situations where Mind Meld can make the difference, but there are plenty of situations where it's like a 7-cost situational card that doesn't do anything until you can sort of end the game with it, and that messes up your fleeting draws and stuff like that, like your picker cards and your stress testing or pool shark draws, or you just top deck it and it's just a blank because you can't do anything with it. So there's a real opportunity cost to it, despite having obviously like the counter argument would be like Rummage and stuff like that, but that's not like that good of an argument because there will still be plenty of situations where you draw it and it messes up stuff, or you can't use it, or you need to draw something that actually does something for you, and then you draw a Mind Meld where it doesn't do enough yet. And you basically skipped your draw step effectively. And you either don't have a way to cycle it, or you don't want to use your Rummage yet, and stuff like that. So there's a lot of like opportunity cost and awkwardness attached to playing a 7-cost card that basically only does something on the last turn of the game, and only after you've like drawn, played, and stuck a critically high enough amount of units, as well as played enough spells, because Aphelios Twisted Fate kind of plays longer, grindier games where and has Aphelios weapons where it's easier to get Mind Meld to big numbers. In this deck, it's much more often the case that Mind Meld is kind of like 5 or 6, meaning you can't just win the game with like 1 or 2 like big elusive units, and you actually often need like 3-4 units that are unblockable in games where the opponent has high health still to actually end them, or end them through potential resistance. Having extra units like a Mind Meld on 2 units in this deck, in my experience, often, like most of the time, isn't enough to end the game anyway. And then if the game goes on, I rather have a card that helps me further my advantage in this scenario rather than have a card that can maybe kill the opponent later, but currently doesn't do anything. But yeah, I think it's still very possible that 1 is a good number, but I'm pretty confident in like 2 being wrong. And maybe that has partially to do with me having played a lot with Butchers, and maybe Butchers make Mind Meld less important because you have more early presence, more early pressure. So you get less into situations where you're kind of playing behind. And that's part of what I liked about the Butchers. The Butchers allow you to be proactive and gain momentum and get out of the gates fast and efficient and get ahead on the board. While if you don't play Pool Sharks, you don't play Butchers, and you play like Mystic Shots and Stress Testings, you don't have a whole lot of presence. You don't have much that blocks. You don't have a lot that can get in combat, because the few units you have, you need to attack. They are like your fragile elusives. So suddenly your opponent kind of just can attack you and pressure you at will, and that can get pretty awkward, and Mystic Shot isn't exactly the best answer to a lot of those situations and scenarios where like a 3/3 blocker can deter multiple units and make attacking for the opponent awkward. The Mystic Shot just kills one of the 2 or 3 marginal units and the others keep bashing you, especially against more aggressive decks. So yeah, Butcher makes you more proactive against control decks where Mystic Shot isn't great, and better against like very aggressive decks where Mystic Shot is also not great. Mystic Shot primarily shines in the mirrors and kind of like the middle ground games where there's a couple of elusives and small champions that might be worthwhile finishing, or you can sort of finish them off in tight races. But the slower the opponent is, the worse Mystic Shot gets, and the faster the opponent is, the worse Mystic Shot gets also, because Mystic Shot is not a great card against aggro. Butcher is a much better card against aggro than Mystic Shot usually is, because yeah, it deters more attacks. Like a lot of the early units in aggro decks are 2/1s, and Butcher is a 3/3 if you play it buffed, and so on, and therefore provides a lot more sort of pressure relief and counter pressure. So yeah, as I said, I think I might want to try like a more traditional approach for this video for the games. If you want to see some of the other variants that I played a lot of it on my stream, so you can check the VODs on my Twitch. So we're gonna give the Mystic Shots a shot, and I think I'm gonna go like 2 pull shark, 1 stress testing, because if I don't have butchers, I think I want at least 2 pull sharks. I really like being able to have like early units as fodder for like pull shark, and to discard the fleeting card to Poro Cannon, double Poro, stuff like that. Have more units for suit up, since even pull shark into suit up is pretty serviceable in a lot of scenarios. And yeah, stress testing has been quite hit or miss. And there are other players that play less stress testings, like I saw, for example, J01 yesterday was playing Fizz Twisted Fate, and he also is only on 1 stress testing. He's on like 1 stress testing, 1 pull shark, and a couple of Jibber rigs. His list is a bit weird, so I don't like exactly agree with his entire list. But he also seems to not think that a large number of stress testing is necessary or desirable, probably for similar reasons that I outlined. All right, that was one of the longest deck tech videos for the deck tech part in a while, but there was a lot, I think, to like go over and discuss, and I hope that was interesting and insightful to you guys. Let me know in the comments what you think and how you feel, and I'll see you in a moment with the Mastering games to show it in action.